Okay, wow. Thank you, Mary. And thank all of you for being here this afternoon. I know it was no small feat to arrive under the circumstances. I mean, we live in Colorado. We're fairly used to the weather. But still, it's wonderful to see so many faces, including my family and many cherished friends and colleagues here today. I'm really honored to be in this position to give this lecture, and I'm particularly honored by the fact that the university lecturer designation comes from my colleagues in the Faculty Senate. Faculty are the lifeblood of any institution of higher learning. They are, or at least should be, the head and the heart. And I'm well aware of the incredible work that scholars are doing all across our campus. And because of that, I'm even more keenly aware of what it means to have been selected to give this lecture. So thank you very much for this honor. I hope I make it worth your while on this snowy afternoon. Before I begin in earnest, I have some thanks I'd like to give. I'd like to thank our excellent AV and catering staff. I'm sure the food's going to be great. The AV already has been awesome, so thanks, folks. Thank you for all that you do to make these gatherings so nice for us all. Big thank you to Fritz. Are you sitting, Fritz? I don't have my glasses on. There he is, Fritz Mayer, my dean, and the members of the Korbel Nominating Committee who put my name forward in consideration for this lecture. Thank you all. And thank you to Korbel's incredible staff and faculty. And I also would just like to recognize a special thanks to Jill Heroux. Jill has been my friend and traveling partner on many legs of my journey here since arriving at Korbel in 2013. I owe you a massive debt of gratitude. I'll never be able to fully repay, but thank you. Closer to home, I'd like to thank my parents, Gail McDougall, Craig Hendrix, and Dana Hendrix, all of whom are here today in case you want to check my biographical details against their collective memory later. Thanks as well to my family and friends, especially my daughter, Lena, who's sitting down here in the front. And thanks most of all to my wife and sometimes collaborator, Sarah Glasser. You'll be hearing a little bit more about her as I move through the rest of the talk. Okay, I've spent my career studying conflict and cooperation around natural resources, as well as the economic and security implications of climate change. And doing that has taken me some interesting places. It's taken me from Lake Victoria in East Africa, where I'm kind of worthless on the deck of a research vessel here. What was that boat called? It's named after an odd-looking bird. If it comes back to you later, remind me, please. I apologize for that. It's taken me there from there to a rock phosphate mine in Morocco, a place I never really thought I would wind up, there in front of a 150-ton dragline. And more recently to Hiroshima, Japan, which is a city that was ravaged by atomic weapons that my grandfather helped create. It's also meant that I've had the honor of working with a pretty diverse set of scientific collaborators, ranging from oceanographers and marine scientists to anthropologists, geographers, economists, data scientists. There may be some disciplines in there that I've forgotten, but all of those I'm for sure. As well as that most prized kind of collaborator and co-author, the student, one of whom is in the audience today. I won't embarrass her by calling her out. It's made for a strange but pretty gratifying career, ultimately. Although it's a career that's been marked by some paradoxes. I'm an international relations scholar who only took 1 quarter worth of seminar in international relations in graduate school. I'm a political scientist who is now on leave from Korbel at the moment, working at the preeminent international economics think tank, despite having taken my last economics class in high school. And this is just a guess, but I think I'm probably either the only or one of just a handful of university lecturers who is also a 2-time college dropout. So it's been a somewhat meandering kind of path. I decided that I wanted to spend my time today discussing one of my research sidelines and one of the largely undiscussed issues that affects not just how my work as a social scientist has developed, but more broadly, how our humanity really conditions our efforts to generate knowledge about and understand the world around us. That's the streetlight effect. The streetlight effect conditions much of what we know or what we think we know about the world. And it's something that affects not just the knowledge we hope to build, but also the lives of people building it. It shapes our vocation, I'll argue, in complicated ways. So what is the streetlight effect? Perhaps you've heard this old saw somewhere. So a policeman sees an intoxicated man searching for something under a streetlight and asks him what he has lost. The man says he lost his keys, and they both begin looking under the streetlight together. After a few minutes, not finding any keys, the policeman asks if the man is sure that he lost them there. And the intoxicated man replies, no, I might have lost them in the park or in the alley or any one of the establishments I've frequented this evening. The policeman asks why he's searching there. And he says, well, this is where the light is. Okay? He's looking where the light is. This general problem that we tend to search for things where it is convenient to do so, even to our detriment, has really been recognized for a long time. I think it's originated with a 13th century, so not a modern streetlight, a 13th century apocryphal tale about Nasreddin, whose tales are often used as vessels for teaching about Sufism. In the social sciences, Abraham Kaplan discussed it way back in 1964 in his classic, The Conduct of Inquiry, around the same time that Robert McNamara was busy applying a particular variant of the streetlight effect, the quantitative fallacy, or disregarding information that's not amenable to counting in decision-making, to getting the US ever more mired in the Vietnam War. As it turns out, counting bodies and keeping score as if the war were some sort of ghoulish kind of basketball game was not a strategy for success. It was, however, a strategy for massive human misery. The streetlight effect is one of those things we all sort of know about, but also kind of tacitly tend to ignore, in part because the implications are so potentially challenging. Put in slightly more socially scientific terms, the streetlight effect is the tendency to focus on particular research questions and subjects and to study them in particular ways for reasons of convenience. Now, the term convenience here, I think, is really worth unpacking. There's nothing particularly convenient about most social science. Colleagues and friends like Marie Berry and Rebecca Galemba may use what's known as convenient sampling in their ethnographic projects, but I hardly imagine talking to survivors of the Rwandan genocide or traveling illicit corn smuggling routes along the Mexico-Guatemala border feels convenient at the time. You can check with them because they're both here. Even those of us who work with kind of more off-the-shelf kind of data sources find it pretty bedeviling to work with. If you don't believe me, you could ask Jonathan Moyer, the director of our Pardee Center, which assimilates thousands and thousands of data series trying to model and understand the world around us. I think he's currently paying the bills by teaching a course, but hopefully we'll see him a little bit later during the celebration part. Now, convenience in this sense really just means using things that are more readily available and studying things people already have demonstrated that they care about, because you only have so much effort to expend, and because the actual scientific work is hard enough. Thank you very much, now get out of my laboratory, right? Convenience in this context is really a matter of degrees. But the streetlight effect shapes how we conduct social science, particularly in the form of what we study and where we choose to study it. And in doing so, it shapes the vocation of social science. So there are professional elements to this as well. We'll spend some time discussing both. So as I mentioned before, I study climate change, albeit from a mostly social scientific perspective. But I'm going to use a natural science example here to motivate the discussion. A lot of what we know about climate and climate change we know from tree ring studies. By studying tree rings, we can get a sense of what past weather patterns and climate were like. So let's say that the trees that I'm going to study are found in two countries. One of them is Kenya, and the other is Somalia. Where do you think I might choose to study them? Well, on the one hand, you have Kenya, English-speaking, relatively politically stable, comparatively democratic, with dozens of flights a day to and from major international hubs. In part for all of these reasons I've elaborated, there's already a robust research infrastructure on the ground. So when you get there, there are people who can help you along your way. And then, once I'm done working, I can probably go on safari or something like that. On the other hand, you have Somalia. English isn't widely spoken. Not that it would really matter much, as the armed guards you would need to safely traverse the country and much of the landscape wouldn't let you do a lot of unstructured cruising around due to the extremely challenging security environment there. As you may have surmised, there aren't a lot of flights that are very convenient, and tourist destinations are pretty hard to come by. So Kenya or Somalia, same trees in either place. I don't think it would be much of a question for most people, which is one of the reasons why people like my wife Sarah, who's done applied development work in Somalia, have my undying respect and admiration. My scholarly work investigating sort of the emphasis that various African countries have received in the broad attempts to understand global climate change kind of bears out the logic that I've just sort of explicated. So if we control for factors like population and the country's physical exposure to climate change, I found that factors like being a former British colony, having more open democratic political systems, and being more politically stable predicted greater scholarly attention on topics related to climate change. And in the case of being a former British colony, close to 3 times as much coverage. On some specific topics within the climate literature, the gap is actually much larger. Now, I'm probably most well known as a scholar for my work on the links between climate change and armed conflict. I decided to replicate my own study, looking at the papers published in the Journal of Peace Research, which is a Norway-based journal for which I've served as an associate editor. And what I found there was both consistent with my earlier findings and actually particularly grim. For a country to receive the same amount of coverage as an Anglophone country, a Francophone or Lusophone country, so a country that had been colonized by France, or a country that had been colonized by Portugal, or Ethiopia, which managed not to really be colonized by anyone, one of those countries would need to suffer 150 times more battle deaths in order to generate the same kind of scholarly attention as one dead person in a former British colony. I think that sort of the normative implications of this, the stark differences that we make implicitly when we do this about the relative values of lives, the relative values of stories, and the relative lessons that these different places have to teach us about the world around us, I think that this gap is truly staggering. It's huge, and it emerges again and again in fields like agricultural economics, development economics, and especially the arm of development economics that's interested in conducting experiments. So what happens if you give mosquito nets to village A and not village B? Or do you get different responses to a survey based on who's administering them? Those kind of questions. In per capita terms, we've studied Kenya about 22 times more than we've studied the Democratic Republic of Congo, despite the fact that there are more Congolese living in bone-crushing, $2 a day poverty than there are Kenyans in the entire world. This stuff matters. It doesn't, and I want to get to why it matters, not just from a normative sense, not for our humanity and the representation of different people's lived experiences and histories, but for why it matters for us as social scientists as well. It suggests that the state of our knowledge about climate and development impacts is biased, even if the underlying studies on which that knowledge is based are not. That Kenya is disproportionately studied matters to the extent that a place like Kenya is different, or not, from the rest of the continent, and that the things that we're interested in are deeply affected by the specific political and economic and social contexts in which they occur. For the trees, it might not matter, but for virtually any phenomenon that we might care about that has a social or human dimension to it, those individuals and those societies are embedded in contexts that matter deeply. So to the extent that we don't know about those contexts, we have a hard time anticipating what the future challenges related to climate change will be in those environments. Policy interventions that work in Kenya may not work in a place like the Central African Republic or Senegal. And so we should be wary about generalizing about any population when we've only studied a very non-randomly sampled subset of it. This is one of the stark implications of the streetlight effect for what it is that we think we know about the world around us as scholars. The streetlight effect doesn't really just affect climate change research. I want to look at kind of the most mainstream possible international relations topic, war. Forgive me, I am an empiricist and I'm a quantitative social scientist, so there's going to be some data, but this is as deep and murky as it gets. So if you can hang with the scatter plot, you'll be all right. These are the deadliest interstate wars, like the war between Russia and Ukraine of the 19th and 20th centuries. On the y-axis, for those of you for whom it's been a while, that's the up and down one, you have estimated battle deaths in those conflicts. This is a rough proxy for the size and significance of the conflict. And on the x-axis, I should say that those values are log normalized because the numbers of deaths ranges from 50,000 to well over 16 million. On the x-axis, you have the number of Google Scholar indexed references to that war that are out there in the literature. This is a very quick and dirty way of approximating how much has been written by scholars on a particular topic. The data demonstrate kind of two things. And so for the red line indicates that for wars, and this is the one that represents the relationship between the number of deaths and the numbers of kind of references in the scholarly literature. Those are the wars in which the United States and the UK were partisans. There's a very tight correlation between the number of battlefield deaths and scholarly studies on the subject. So as more lives are lost in the conflict, there's more research on that conflict. It's a very tight correlation. For those of you who care, it's an R of 0.94. That's roughly double the strength of the correlation between height and shoe size. So it's a pretty significant correlation. However, if the United States or the UK were not partisan, scholarly interest, that blue line that you're seeing there is weakly moving upwards, so it's maybe a little bit more emphasis, but not a lot. Means that it's less a function just of battle deaths and due to some other idiosyncratic factors that are not necessarily associated with the magnitude of the conflict. That means two things, right? It means we know a lot less about wars in which the United States and UK didn't participate than the ones that they did participate in, and we don't. What it is that drove people to be interested in those other wars, we don't well understand. Now, I've characterized the streetlight effect as arising primarily from supply-side issues related to research feasibility. But there's a demand-side element to this as well. Some topics excite popular interest and imagination. And because these topics kind of do good business, right? They cause classes to fill up, they can sell popular works that scholars generate in order to try and break into kind of the mainstream discussion, have a book at the airport, kind of so to speak, right? They tend to receive vastly more mainstream and scholarly attention than others. There's probably been more written on the two world wars than there has been on every other war in the past 2 centuries combined. I don't think that's actually a very difficult to substantiate statement. And we care about these wars an immense amount. One of the odds-on favorites for Best Picture next year at the Academy Awards will be Oppenheimer, which is a movie about the creation and deployment of atomic bombs that were dropped almost 80 years ago. I can think just off the top of my head of 3 different movies that have been made in the last couple of decades in which Brad Pitt punches a Nazi, right? Like, we are still obsessed with these things. So reflecting on our seemingly insatiable demand for this kind of World War-related content, I came to the realization that world wars are kind of like the charismatic megafauna of security studies research. This realization led me to what still stands as the most fun I've ever had thinking about and writing about rampant death and destruction. That is the process of writing this little piece, Charismatic Megafauna in Conflict Studies, or why World War II is the giant panda of the conflict and security field. For the non-ecologists among us, charismatic megafauna are large animal species with widespread popular appeal. The panda might be the most charismatic of them all. These are animals that excite the imagination. They generate traffic jams at zoos and make for fantastic kind of National Geographic pictorials. Right? If there's a plush version of it at the gift shop in your local zoo or aquarium, you're dealing with a charismatic organism. Though they represent a tiny fraction of the species that make up our world's fauna, they are responsible for a massive amount of scientific policy and popular attention. They turn the streetlight into a spotlight, so to speak. This has implications that I think are both good and bad, both for the nature of our understanding of history and international affairs, and frankly the world wars, but also for scholarship and for what is for many of us our shared vocation. So I'm going to start with the good, right? We probably should pay attention to the world wars. And charismatic megafauna are important. It's important to know about the deadliest conflicts in human history. Whether we're approaching kind of the point of diminishing marginal returns is kind of another matter. But nevertheless, just as it would be kind of impossible to imagine a survey of African wildlife that didn't mention the elephant or the rhino in some capacity, a treatise on 20th century military history that didn't mention the world wars would be missing, right, the elephant in the room. The charismatic megafauna of conflict studies inherently matter more in ways the charismatic megafauna of the animal kingdom probably don't. They're just good-looking animals that humans like, right? The charismatic megafauna of the conflict studies world, of international relations, shape the world in which we live to a remarkable degree. Some of those ways are obvious, some of those are much more hidden. The Joseph Corbell School, where we are right now, named for our founding dean and a refugee from both the Nazis and the communists, maybe doesn't exist absent the Second World War. Or at the very least, it might be called something different. Anna and John C., right, who graciously endowed both the C Center, of which I'm an affiliate, and this beautiful complex we're in today, perhaps they don't wind up immigrating to the United States from China and Italy, respectively. The world is a very different place without them. Second reason why charismatic megafauna and their existence for security studies might be a good thing. They're the gateway drugs, if you will, of scientific inquiry. They draw people into fields of study. Once they get into that field of study, they often stray from studying the charismatic megafauna and focus on other organisms or ecosystems. My wife is an oceanographer, and she first fell in love with social science through vivid images of coral reefs teeming with bright anemones, sleek reef sharks, and clownfish. She wound up for her dissertation doing gut content analysis of Pacific albacore, right? Messy work. Right, she came for the brightly colored fish, she stayed for the hard science and data collection. Similarly, I would argue the big wars draw people into security studies. The charismatic megafauna of security studies are the conflicts that launch 1,000 careers in security studies, in development, and diplomacy. They bring people into the practice. And practically for researchers, charismatic megafauna drive popular interest in research support. Charismatic megafauna inspire popular imagination to a degree that smaller conflicts can't, or don't anyway. Similarly, big wars or interventions by major powers catalyze interest in conflict studies and drive research dollars toward the field. But the presence of these kind of charismatic beasts in conflict studies is not an unalloyed blessing, neither for the field nor for the policy community. There's some bad that comes with their existence as well. And this is where the pernicious aspects of the streetlight effect really come into the spotlight, or the streetlight, I suppose. First, charismatic megafauna are charismatic for idiosyncratic and often really biased reasons. Okay? The snow leopard and the Cuban solandin are both endangered mammals. I imagine all of you can imagine what a snow leopard looks like right now. A snow leopard was actually picked National Geographic's Image of the Year for this year. It's beautiful, right? You'd love a sweatshirt with one of them airbrushed on it. It's that kind of animal. The Cuban solandin is also an endangered species, but the Cuban solandin is a small mammal that looks like a rat with a significant underbite. Okay? Can you imagine having one of those on a t-shirt? Right? It has a venomous snoot, so to speak, that only its mother could presumably love. Now, the former may not be any more important than the latter from an ecological perspective, but it certainly garners a lot more attention. And if we're being honest with ourselves, frankly, pretty superficial kinds of reasons. There are probably good reasons for lavishing more scholarly interest on some cases than others, but there are also bad or at least idiosyncratic ones as well. As the data that I presented a few moments ago show, one characteristic of charismatic megafauna of conflict studies is that they tend to involve Anglophone combatants. Maybe we can talk about why that's the case in the Q&A, assuming I'm able to leave time for some. Second reason why they're potentially dangerous is that generalizing from charismatic megafauna can be quite misleading. So charismatic megafauna are atypical and odd. That's almost by definition. Their oddness is related to both their size. In the animal kingdom, they tend to be large organisms, and their appearance, but also the things that kind of make them unlike other organisms. This certainly makes them interesting topics to study, but it also makes them extremely dangerous cases from which to generalize. So giant pandas are members of the Ursidae family, so they're classified, like other bears, as carnivores. Yet, as probably all of you know, their diet consists almost entirely of bamboo. So if you're teaching Ecology 101, right, the giant panda would make a really bad example for trying to motivate a discussion of carnivorism. Okay? Similarly, the world wars were, at least so far, kind of astonishingly unique events, both in terms of their magnitude and their complexity. But they're also the most studied conflicts by far. That is, more scholarly attention has been devoted to thinking about atypical cases than to thinking about more typical ones. I think this has pretty vast consequences. Because military historians and security scholars have devoted so much attention to these charismatic megafauna, I think it's fairly likely that most policymakers fall back on mental models derived from these atypical cases when they're thinking about warfighting and conflict processes and diplomacy. So, if we wind the clock back to 2003, there were many senior officials in the Bush administration who claimed that coalition forces were going to be greeted by the Iraqis as liberators, and that the occupation would be relatively peaceful, and it was going to provide this kind of vast kind of beacon of hope for pro-democracy movements in the broader Middle East. Now, given that most of those policymakers, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. I am assuming that they were sincere in these beliefs. Given that most of them had probably spent more time reading and thinking about the post-World War II occupations and liberations than all other 20th century or 19th century military occupations combined, I can imagine why it is that they would think that. The Netherlands and France went swimmingly, right? Why would Iraq be any different? If you ask any social scientist or any comparativist or international relations scholar, indeed there was a public letter, I believe in the New York Times or Washington Post at the time, warning this is going to go terribly because this place is nothing like the ones that policymakers are drawing on to inform their thinking about it. And then finally, charismatic megafauna can crowd out the study of other important organisms. So when researchers and conservationists study charismatic megafauna, their study of those organisms benefits the other organisms that inhabit the ecosystems that these charismatic megafauna live in via the attention. So the World Wildlife Fund can do things like portray polar bears as emblematic of the decline and precarity of Arctic climates. Or they can talk about sea turtles as lightning rods for concerns about longlining and overfishing of the oceans, and so on. Because these megafauna depend on a complex ecosystem to exist and survive, efforts to study them and to conserve them provide spillovers for the whole of the ecosystems and, that support them and the less heralded less heralded species within those ecosystems. With the charismatic megafauna of conflict studies, this really isn't the case. Understanding World War II, for instance, doesn't necessarily increase our stock of knowledge related to other conflicts that are like it because, well, there really aren't other conflicts that are much like it. But early career scholars face really strong professional incentives to base their studies on familiar cases in order to speak to the existing literature. That is, they want to be able to build upon the work and satisfy the egos of senior scholars and to find a wide audience. Now, their works may or may not illuminate conflict dynamics in other cases. They may be broadly applicable, but they certainly gobble up kind of editors' time and attention in the review process. And for these same reasons, editors, the people who are publishing the scholarly works that we're generating, they face implicit encouragement to publish studies on very widely studied cases and subjects. Now, what I'm describing here is in no way unique to security studies, right, or the study of climate change. The unstated and unrecognized factors that shape what we study are consequential for how we view the world, and I don't mean that just as social scientists, I mean that as people. The streetlight effect certainly biases our attention in specific directions, or at least that's what my research suggests. But I suspect that for most of us, what it is that we've chosen to study, to dedicate so much of ourselves to, is shaped by the experiences and relationships that give our lives meaning. That is, our careers as scholars are shaped by the streetlight effect, which narrows the aperture of what our disciplinary training has told us is important. But our lives give each one of us a unique flashlight, or set of interests and abiding concerns that we carry into the world with us. Now, my first job was at a family-owned fruit company that grew and traded table and juice grapes in California's Central Valley. It was the Triborough Fruit Company. I made coffee, I answered phones, generally did whatever was asked of me, including salvaging some saleable onions from a bulk shipment that had spoiled in transit. Now, even at 13, I knew handling rotten onions on an uncovered loading dock in 110-degree weather was a pretty bad beat. That's a pretty bad day at the office. I was inside for a lot of it too, and quite a bit of the talk around the office was frankly way over my head. I was around enough, however, to get an intuitive sense of how changing prices for grapes could make smart salespeople look kind of dumb, and frankly, vice versa. And here I am, what is this, 32 years later, right? I'm still tracking commodity prices and how they both drive and respond to government policies. I can spin you a really convincing intellectual academic yarn about, why it is as an international relations scholar, I find global fisheries and the governance challenges they occasion such an interesting topic. And that would all be true. I would tell no lies in doing that, save for the fact that I would be basically lying my butt off by omission, right? Why do I study these things? I fell in love with a marine scientist. I learned from her, and we explored ways to work together. That's it. That's the tweet. That's the truth. That's part of how I came to be who I am. So, wow. I didn't think I was going to do that to myself. One of the great joys of academic research is that we are ostensibly free to study what we like. We can follow our flashlights wherever they take us. Given how much of our lives and our hearts and our souls we invest in our work, this is a true blessing. But this freedom has consequences. And one of those consequences is that following your flashlight and straying from the streetlight, choosing to study unconventional topics or cases, comes with some real risk. Our friends at the College of the William and Mary have collected comprehensive data on almost 9,000 articles published over 40 years in the leading international relations journals. And they did a lot of things with those articles, but they coded them for research topic. That's very small. Don't worry, you don't need to read it all. What you do need to notice is that the environment as a topic is way out here in the tail. Public health, which is a subject of, more than a little consequence given what we've all just lived through in the last few years, is even further to the left, or in this case, I guess it's kind of right of the dial, right? Out here in the discipline, in the study of international relations, we're spending a lot of time navigating by flashlight, frankly, outside of the spotlight and the streetlight. And so it can get pretty dark. I've spent most of my career studying topics that are on the fringes of what's considered mainstream international relations. I probably should have called this talk Social Science Away from the Streetlight. At a blissfully interdisciplinary place like the Korbel School, this actually hasn't worked against me. It's probably worked in my favor. At least I'd like to think it has. But I've been told flatly by some mainstream political scientists that I wouldn't be qualified to work at their institutions. And I've seen very brilliant early career scholars struggle to find a place for themselves at the table, even at a time when academic institutions are ostensibly going out of their way to promote interdisciplinary work. Now, in my case, I think I got lucky. The world didn't get lucky, but I got lucky. Climate change as a security issue emerged in policy circles around the time my career was getting going. And I was able to benefit from kind of catalytic early career funding from the Department of Defense and the National Science Foundation. But it could have really gone differently had events and the mounting evidence of climate change and humanitarian crises in places like Darfur and Syria not pushed climate change closer to the warm light of academic credibility and interest. My life could have been very different. Bob Dylan wrote that to live outside the law, you must be honest. Well, I would contend that to study outside of the streetlight, so to speak, you must be resilient and adaptable. You will have to live with being a contributor, potentially, to many different epistemic communities, but a fully vested citizen, perhaps, of none. Ecologists would classify you as displaying preferred habitat plasticity, like another animal, raccoons, right? Raccoons are nothing if not resilient to changing environs and times. And that's mostly a good thing. But your generalist tendencies as a social scientist may be overshadowed and under-recognized by those who are more at home in defined disciplinary ecosystems working on topics that are deemed legitimate by disciplinary gatekeepers. We wait in line to see pandas, animals whose habitat plasticity is famously low at zoos, right? We put locks on our trash can to avoid seeing raccoons. So, look, there are some students in the room or early career researchers. I do want to say this. Following your flashlight or doing your own thing off on the fringes can be daunting, but it's exhilarating also. even if and when you can't convince most people to come with you into kind of the dark and woolly wild. It's okay. You'll convince some, and those are the ones who really matter. Those are the ones you want next to you, frankly, when you set out to sail, as my brother wrote, the coast of nowhere, searching for things that can only be found, as Bruce Springsteen wrote, in the darkness on the edge of town. Thank you.